Okay, so thank you, Daniel, for taking the time to answer the questions that I'm going to be asking you today for the students at the University of Waterloo. I know that what you're doing has been very valuable, and I know that you telling the students about it will also be extremely valuable. I wanted to start just by you telling me a bit about the RAND Corporation. Some of the people watching this won't know what RAND is and what RAND does. So can you tell me about RAND and what your role is there?
Sure. So RAND is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank in the United States. It works on a range of policy issues from health, economics, education, and defense. Me personally, I'm a political scientist there at the RAND Corporation, and my substantive background is technology and international affairs. But I have done some work on criminal justice, and as you know, racially and ethically motivated violent extremism. Most of my work does involve some sense of qualitative methods as well. So I think particularly relevant to this interview, that project on racially and ethically motivated violent extremism and the use of AI ML, specifically natural language processing, applied to that sort of research question is what I'm currently doing.
And you're doing very important, also very interesting work, and as a researcher, to be doing work that you know is going to have an effect very soon is of course, I think, probably very motivating and stimulating.
Oh, yeah.
But I thought I'd start just by asking about your work. You started to talk about it being focused on racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism, REMVE. Can you begin by explaining what that is and to what extent is it increasing today?
Yeah, so REMVE as a term is used to describe targeted violence towards individuals of a specific racial or ethnic group. And that will be like context or nation dependent, because this is not just a US issue, it's a sort of worldwide issue, and a lot of countries are seeing sort of upticks in REMVE attacks. So to the extent that it is increasing, we could definitely say it has been increasing for some time now. And you see this sort of come out, at least in the United States, in sort of mass shooting effects. So in 2015, there was a Charleston shooting that targeted primarily Black Americans. 2018 was Pittsburgh, the targeted synagogue. 2019 Christchurch was a mosque. 2019 El Paso was a Walmart targeting Mexicans. 2022 Buffalo, again, African Americans. So we're definitely in a period in which it is increasing, especially here in the United States. And I think that's pretty evident to folks who are just casual observers, but even people who go through the data and actually go through the effort of collecting sort of REMVE events, or even like adjacent incidents like hate crimes, do have identified a recent uptick in them.
Very sad, and of course means that your work's very important. Clearly, that work's important because persecution of those groups that you've mentioned and others, of any group based on their race or ethnicity, is bad for those victims. But you've also said that its consequences for society more generally, for societal cohesion, are also important. So can you just expand on that a bit and explain why that's important?
Sure, and that's a thread from pulled from the hate crime literature about why hate crimes are so different. And crime in general is just bad. So crimes affect the individual, the family members. It changes how they sort of approach and carry out their day. But when you target people on the basis of their identity and their community, now an entire community feels unsafe. So the impact goes much wider than what you would expect in a regular, and not that crime should be regular, but in your unracially motivated crime or attack, it's slightly different. So the consequence of that is that that community feels less safe, and if it's less safe, it's less willing to sort of participate in everything that society needs to function. Whether it's at least from the criminology literature, it's like reporting crimes. Like, how would you report crimes if you felt that the police could protect you from like REMVE attacks or racially motivated extremism? Those sort of consequences are very real. And if it's not directly impacting like their personal need for safety and security within a location or city, it's definitely going to affect how they sort of view their role in that society. And in the United States, where the United States is as diverse as it is, that's pretty important, because we want to be inclusive and we want everyone who is in the United States to feel sort of included. So when attacks like that happen, they definitely do undermine that social fabric and the understanding that we're all Americans.
And so basically what you're saying is that a racially or ethnically motivated attack is an attack that affects everyone. It affects the quality of life in society generally, and
Yeah.
very important. Okay, so how does the internet impact REMVE?
Yeah.
Does it cause radicalization? We've certainly seen a lot of that reported. And if it does cause radicalization, then how does it do that? And thinking particularly recently, to what extent do we see copycat behavior?
Yeah. My perspective on that is not the sense that the internet itself will generate manifestos randomly, or it doesn't spawn hate movements in itself. So it does facilitate them, and it does as a sort of conduit for these ideas and groups to have more sort of accessibility. So for example, in the Christchurch shootings, that manifesto inspired the El Paso shootings, and the actual shooter did make a post about it in 4chan, specifically pointing to the Christchurch manifesto. So in the sense that it facilitates sort of connections between, unfortunately, very like-minded individuals, I think the internet is doing that. Then I also see that the copycat behavior is very general and it's applied to different things. So primarily, I've been focusing mostly on REMVE violence, but there is an eye at looking at other kinds of targeted violence, or just targeted violence in general, because what we have been seeing is not only violence against different racial and ethnic groups, but also sexual orientations. The LGBTQ community has also suffered some mass shooting attacks. So in the sense that there's copycat behavior, in the sense that the internet is sort of driving this, I mean, it's ultimately a conduit and people make the communities. So that's sort of where I would say is it's making the proliferation of these ideas more readily available for people who may not necessarily find themselves in that position to begin with, or hold those beliefs to begin with, I should say.
So it's enabling people to come into contact with those ideas more easily than they would have before, and at the same time to connect perhaps with other people who they share those ideas with, or to participate in communities that might reinforce those ideas with them. Is that what you're saying? Or
yeah, that's the crux of it. But another thing too is, and I think this is in a follow-up question that, if you don't mind, I'll just skip ahead to it.
Sure.
Is that why does radicalization continue? And the sort of answer to that is that it's partly a technical reason, so having to deal with software and algorithms. It's partly sort of a social reason. The technical reasons could be pretty clear, and that first reason could be that it is just simply more accessible. You can go to a neo-Nazi website. You can go to more seedy parts of the internet where they do talk about this and are very explicit about the sort of REMVE beliefs. So it is more accessible. The second thing is that there could be some algorithmic sort of work at play. Right now, there's sort of an attention economy, and if what keeps your attention most are these sorts of ideas or these sorts of content, or if it thinks that this will be the sort of content that will keep you engaged on a platform, then it'll feed it to you without necessarily realizing that it's doing so. So in that case, that could be one way in which the technical aspects of the internet are increasing radicalization. And then there are sort of social issues too. And those are, frankly, I think, pretty complicated. It could be that folks are just sort of hold a set of social beliefs and attitudes wherein REMVE attacks or hate crimes are more or less acceptable to them based on how they understand the world. And that is sort of a harder challenge. And although I haven't spent too much time thinking and pulling on these two threads, from my experience and where I stand, I think those are the two sort of drivers towards increasing radicalization. Hopefully that answers part of your questions.
It does. One part of what you said seemed to be talking about how it makes the internet can help people to feel that their views are more acceptable than they might have been otherwise. And my understanding, and I'm asking if I'm correct, would be that because they're able to become part of these online communities or exposed to the content online, that makes someone feel that this is more normal and something that that makes them more likely to do themselves.
Yeah, there is definitely an echo chamber sort of effect there. But at the same time, they seem pretty aware that their opinions are not the majority. Like I think it's sort of a contrast. It's they know that their REMVE beliefs aren't necessarily popular or viewed as by the wider society as acceptable, but they still hold it because they have a core of support. Someone wrote an article a while ago. What was it? It was something along the lines of there's no such thing as lone wolves when it comes to like lone wolf attackers. Because wolves as animals are very social animals, and rarely do you see a lone wolf. Usually a lone wolf is its transition from one community to another. And when they looked at sort of shooters in that context, because they're considered like lone wolf attacks, they basically came across the conclusion that it was that they actually do have a sense of community, that they are not lone wolves. They run in a pack, and that pack it traffics in hate online. So that's something that was pretty interesting when I thought about, or when I came across it. I think it's Talia Levine who had that initial post, I think. Yeah.
Okay, so what are the challenges in reducing it? Because if the acts of violence and extremism are increasing, so clearly that would indicate that our efforts to reduce it are struggling, maybe.
The United States sort of, it might be partly a case of guns getting in the hands of people who shouldn't have them, so they commit mass shooting attacks. From a social perspective, it's a difficult process of trying to make it so that people don't view other groups as sort of the other in whatever mental conceptualization of society that they have. And that's a hard ask, because you're asking to do a lot of sort of, you're asking to sort of have people update their beliefs based on some sort of engagement. And that is hard, especially when people are sort of either baked into either in their own communities where they don't have opportunities to do so, or they refuse to, or there's just a set of socially reinforcing pressures that prevent people from moving past whatever prejudice used to hold. So like the social problem there is very hard to deal with. The sort of more technical problems could be fixed, or if not addressed, but with like some effort. So if you're a platform who gets revenue based on attention, and that sending people down an extremist rabbit hole makes their attention with your platform increase, well, then you'll go ahead and do that. Should there be counters or sort of counterweights to that? Absolutely, I think there should. But exactly how you go about doing that, and how, at least again in the United States, how you do that with respect to maintaining some values that we have, like freedom of speech, is important. It's a delicate balance that the United States itself is trying to find. That said, people do try and de-radicalize others. It's just that those efforts, I believe, mostly take shape offline. And because there's so many of them who are actually trying to do this, it's hard to keep a track on like how effective or what the progress is towards that goal. So unfortunately, I see that as sort of like a non-answer to your question. But hopefully at least it identifies some of the complications with trying to reduce it.
But what you're saying, as you are considering what the best ways might be to reduce it, is that people who disagree with each other need to talk to each other more. Then that seems to be partly, one of the main things you're saying about what we need to do to reduce this. And there are things we can all do possibly to help that to happen.
Yeah, I think someone pointed out it's hard to hate up close
Hmm.
when you're talking about other people, and I think that's generally true. People definitely have their own mental models of what other people are like or what groups are like. Maybe in the form of stereotypes, maybe in the form of learned experience, maybe in the form of whatever someone told them. But once you're faced with the reality of a living, breathing person who's sort of different, that can sort of erode that. But I also want to point out that some of these processes are indeed social. So you could go ahead and um, I guess bring down the social temperature if people were to engage more earnestly with one another. But I also recognize that there's a whole slew of other issues, more systemic issues that aren't necessarily dependent on individual persons. So like um, it might be some sort of like systemic bias against one kind of crime versus another kind of crime that might impact it. So, like, for example, uh, if you over prosecute like blue collar crimes versus white collar crimes, and for some reason someone thinks that's part of a big global conspiracy involving globalists, using globalists as code for Jews, well, then that person's still going to adhere to that. But then that's completely removed because that deals more with the system than it deals with that person's sort of beliefs. And this is tangling who's who and how they get to their beliefs and what you can do to fix it. Um, yeah, I think that's going to be important too. And I think yeah, it makes sense that sort of an all front sort of approach to decreasing radicalization is important.
That makes sense. So there are other factors at play. It'll be better if it'd be good if people talk to each other more that disagree, but there are factors that are influencing that disagreement that are more than simply going to be resolved by people, getting close to each other.
Yeah, yeah, I think recognizing that and separating, institutions or systems from people, I think is also key. I feel like, yeah, I feel like that's definitely a sticking point for a lot of people, like having to disentangle the two. Because as primarily social beings, we think about A and B, me and you, but we don't think about the wider context in which we operate, at least not natively. And I think doing that and sort of properly ascribing causes or problems to those issues would probably help us go a long way.
Okay, so your work is focused on finding and exploring and analyzing extremist discussions online, so that those could be better understood and addressed, especially as that rapidly evolves. So that's changing very, very quickly. You've been concerned to enable the identification of new terms being used in groups and their meaning. You developed an AI tool that would help this. So what did you do technically to create it?
Sure.
And how was it applied?
Sure. And let me know. I'll give you a broad overview. And if you need me to get more technical, I'm happy to.
Okay.
So a couple years ago, our colleague Pete Shermer had the idea of using latent semantic topic modeling to identify words that are sort of close together in context that tells you a little bit about what their meaning is. And his sort of approach or thinking was that these communities develop their own sort of like language and their own sort of jargon to describe and discuss things that your ordinary person outside of this community wouldn't, and I guess for good reason, because not every if your primary concern is worrying about what racial and ethnically motivated extremists would do, you probably aren't fluent in their language or terminology. So you need some tool to help you do that. And what we originally did was take a slice of 4chan and then try and find some word associations. And it was primarily identified or thought of as like just an exploration tool. So it'll rack and stack words based on the similarity with this like latent semantic topic modeling model. And then there was an interesting thread you'd pull on, like you would hit you would hit Nazi and then you get to Adidas, the Adidas being like an arms manufacturer, not the shoe company, or at least I think it's a security company. And then once you click on the security company, you find that it's sort of mentioned alongside a resistance front in Australia with sort of white supremacist overtones. And if I recall that correctly, I think that's what sort of spurred off this sort of thread of trying to better understand and explore language on some of these websites. So the most recent effort, we decided to come up with different methods to describe how words are emerging or not. So a couple of them were using that some latent semantic indexing and then comparing how much that has changed. So of how much has one word's total grouping, or how much has that one word's feature vector changed from one time period to another, where that feature vector is sort of the pairwise comparison between different words. Long story short, is it being used in a different context than before in a fundamental way between these two periods? Because then that tells you there's something different about this term that's being used. Another thing we used obviously was sort of like raw usage account. So is it being discussed more? And another one we wanted to do, but we ran short on resources, being time and funding, was to look at the proliferation across different websites. So the sort of example that we go with is Glowies. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the term Glowies or if it was
No.
evidence from abstract. Okay, it came out, I think in like 2017, 2018, and Glowies was used to describe like US government agents operating on these social media platforms, trying to catch people doing nefarious things or trying to goad them into doing crimes. And they're called the glowies because they're so painfully obvious that they're government agents trying to like catch you or make you do something illegal that they glow in the dark. So glowies, admittedly, is not the first first form of that word. It's actually more vulgar in its start. And then we have a full report sort of discussing the where it came from and what it sort of means down the pipe. But basically, glowies has been taken to mean anyone who is online and sort of like a government agent. But what's interesting is that if you look at the different metrics and if you look at sort of like the words that it was most closely associated with over time, you'll find that the context changes dramatically. So like at one point, glowies is associated with like government agents trying to impose some like liberal, and I use like American liberal values here. So within the context of our political system, sort of like leftish values on some internet community. And then the pivot point is sort of the death of Jeffrey Epstein, when the word glowies, the context for that term changed completely, where it became less so more of like an overseeing authoritarian figure imposing values down from on high. It became a more active combatant association between sort of some of its top words. And we were able to flag that, at least that spike in that context metric over time. So kind of show that this does capture, one, how the context is changing over time, and could help you identify sort of what the words are that have changed more often than not between sort of a specific time period. So I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly why. We just knew through our qualitative research that Jeffrey Epstein's murder, or sorry, his death, was sort of like a pivot point for that term. And sorry, I said murder because they believe he was murdered. He died in prison. So that's their narrative on it.
Yeah.
So that's one thing the tool does do, and it does provide you those metrics over time. And do you need me to get more technical than that? Because there's some more systems there.
No, I think that's technical enough. It certainly is for me, but for some of the people watching, they might have wanted to know a lot more. But I think for what we're talking about today, that's probably sufficient. As far as so that's how it worked. Can you talk more about the value of the tool? So what was it? What's it useful for?
Yeah, it's definitely useful for finding new terms on a given social media website where you're like pointed to. So if you're interested in this field and you want to keep tabs on, what REMVE movements are talking about, you have to churn through a lot of chaff. And even when you do find something, you're not always assured that you found the right post, or that if this is even the right interpretation of a post. So you could find a word in that one post where someone's using it completely incorrectly, than sort of what it's like commonly used as. So what the tool helps you do is it helps you just sort of find those increasing word associations. So even if you're unsure what a word means, so like for example, for glowies, at least in the last time period that we ran it through, if you typed in like authority, you would get glowies sort of at the top. So, but then you would also get things like if you were to type in glowies, you'd get authority, then you'd get I think like incompetent or some other words. And it was sort of like a mix of meanings that told you that they didn't take glowies all that seriously, because again, I mean, it's government agents trying to be like cool and hip on these like edgy websites. So like they know they're sort of stale in comparison. And if you needed to get that explanation, but weren't able to actually find it defined because either the term is too new, so it's not out there in the world, it's not defined in an Urban Dictionary, it's not on any wiki page, it's not on any like any other observers, and this would be one way to triangulate the meaning before it's sort of too late. And by too late, meaning that it's everyone knows it. And by the time they know that everyone else knows it, they sort of move to a different term.
Okay, so it helps you to interpret conversations online more accurately than you were able to interpret them before.
I would say terms, less of conversations. Okay. You're not looking at individual posts. It's just giving you like glowies and then a list of closely associated words, and then sort of emerging metrics for all the words, including loads. Okay. So it's providing context for the terms that you might not otherwise have.
Okay, which would make it easier for people that were looking at those conversations and trying to understand everything they might want to understand from it. It gives them a more accurate understanding. Right. Okay, that sounds good. So what further applications of that work do you see in the future? Yeah,
one, I think I alluded to it earlier, but we were focusing on REMVE, so racially and ethically racially and ethically motivated violent extremism, but there's targeted extremism sort of like writ large. So it may not necessarily be racially and ethically motivated. I mean, I mentioned before the LGBTQ shootings or mass shooting events, like those are clearly targeted, and that clearly has a similar community impact. But if we were to focus just on REMVE discussions, that would not necessarily be in our data set.
Yeah.
So figuring out ways to sort of generalize the tool, and I think it's based on the approach that we did, we could generalize it to other sorts of topics. And I think that's sort of where we probably need to go, because I think one thing that is coming up is, or has been coming up, is more targeted violence towards the LGBTQ communities, but also like the language around that might change too. So there was a while back when actually I just want to make sure that I don't give either incorrect or outdated information.
Sure.
But there are some comparisons of LGBTQ people unfairly and incorrectly to pedophilia by some corners of the internet. And then if it's sort of known that that pedophilia is one of those it's like one of those I guess it's called cardinal internet sin, where there's sort of like no holds bar in terms of punishment. So you could exercise the most abhorrent punishment towards whoever like committed that crime as you wanted to. And one of the concerns is that this increasing association, and I want to say increasing unfair and incorrect association between the LGBTQ community and pedophilia is already sort of making them a target for violent extremism. So being able to pick up on that before individuals or observers of these sort of threats are too far behind the curve is going to be important. So if I think about extending the tool, it's definitely looking at different kinds of targeted violence, and then being able to identify those ahead of time.
Makes sense. And presumably in understanding any conversations that may be taking place anywhere on the internet, a tool that enabled someone from a different culture to better understand a conversation in a culture that wasn't theirs, it would enable that too, which could have
It could.
many applications, you would think.
Yeah, and actually related, and this came up when we were talking it within RAND. Someone brought up that this would be useful for like parents as well. So like you might not know what your kid is saying when they're playing Fortnite or whatever, or what other people are saying. And if you're not plugged in playing the game, you're not going to know. And if you're not exposed to it, you're not going to know. So it might be sort of like a general dictionary of like terms or words that the kids are using these days, that may or may not be problematic. That might be one application of it, but I see the value in that. So it's not entirely it's not what you mentioned. It's not entirely different languages, but it kind of might as well be given I guess the age differences.
And I mean, my mind couldn't help going. This might be very inappropriate to a version of Google Translate that had incorporated this technology that a parent could use to interpret what their child was saying to them, or what their teenager presumably was saying to them with their phone.
Oh, yeah, that would be.
I couldn't resist. But
yeah, it's definitely hard to keep track.
Yeah. Okay. So, are there any risks associated with the tool that would need to be taken into account? So, what I'm thinking about here is, with many technologies, there are many ways they could be used, and sometimes very negative ways. And are there risks associated with this tool?
Yeah, one might be like unfair sort of associations with like a small number of observations. So like if a word is mentioned once, then it's kind of at the whims of statistical randomness to tell you where you're associated with and what you're associated with. So if you don't take care to make sure that you have like a stable set of tokens, you could end up with unfair connections, or worse, you might pick up with things that shouldn't be in your data set. So making sure the data is properly sanitized is important, because if you just point it at a social media website, there's no telling what'll sort of be scooped up. So you might scoop up like a private individual's name, you might scoop up someone's like account, you might scoop up like some sort of adjacent PII. So making sure that doesn't make it into the tool is important, and making sure whatever data goes in is sort of solid enough so you're not drawing these incorrect conclusions. Another thing too is it'll tell you the result and it'll find it for you, but it won't give you the interpretation of it. So that requires some subject matter expertise in either the language or the topic at hand to sort of more fully understand what it is they're talking about. So the risk there, of course, is human error, but you can never really get away from human error. All you can kind of do is try and mitigate it, which is what we try to do here. Those are some of the risks. Another risk too, which I think is important for the United States to consider, is just the freedom of speech and not wanting to inadvertently restrict speech. Because I think that is a value that we adhere pretty closely to. Because I know other countries have explicit laws on hate speech. The United States does not. So in accordance with that, we have to have this delicate balance between trying to keep an eye on how language is evolving and what's being discussed, without necessarily making folks feel like or feel like they've lost some sort of privacy, which is not the point. So you definitely don't. Oh yeah, you definitely should not point this tool or anything like this at any private user groups who are willfully sort of excluding themselves from the public sphere. But also take pains to make sure that people who do self-select out, because I think like Twitter, Reddit allows you to delete your account and then all your past deletes or tweets are gone. Making sure that when that occurs, the tool doesn't pick up those old deleted tweets, because people should have a right to sort of self-select out. So being as respectful of everyone's time and information, privacy and information as you can, I think that's important. And I think those are the risks that sort of come to mind right now with using the tool. And I think these are generally risks that other methods or other approaches or other analytical techniques will also have. it's just that when you start to scale up these risks because you have a huge data set, you can pay even more attention to them.
Yeah, that makes sense. And thank you. I just got one final question. Many of the people watching will be working with artificial intelligence in their careers. And I thought I would just ask a final question
Sure.
about the guidance that you would like to leave them with.
Yeah. Yeah, the thing I would leave them with is bear in mind that the use of AI won't just be for prediction. It seems like AI for explanation or for exploration will also be key. And I think part of the wider community or observers in the space are sort of realizing that with the advent of more, I guess, competent generative models, so like ChatGPT or DALL-E, as sort of ways to either like soundboard off ideas or generate sort of quick pieces or check logic or ask for an explanation. And the sort of, I guess, the sort of new agency that comes with some of these models should be considered, and how to properly leverage those in an increasingly complicated world would be important. But with all those come the same foibles as sort of before. Oh, and I forgot to mention this, but also the data, making sure you have a representative data source and making sure that you understand that the data that you run the tool with doesn't extrapolate to other data sources. So like if we analyze 4chan, we analyze 4chan. We can't go to even 8chan or, you know, a neo-Nazi website and then say that this is the terminology over there, because yeah, it has to match your data, or rather your findings and analysis should be data scoped. So yeah, circling back, sorry to jump around, but it would be considered those alternative uses of AI, not just for prediction, but explanation, exploration, and even sort of for interaction. Because I think those are interesting and developing areas that I think people will need to think on before they fully use. And finally, speaking strictly from someone who is working at a think tank looking at a think tank who does interact with sort of policymakers or, you know, policy analysis or analysts in government, you don't need much to get a lot of good traction out of artificial intelligence. It does not need to be the most sophisticated model to be useful to somebody, because although some percentage improvement in performance is great for the model, ultimately folks need something that works. Nonprofits need something that works. They need something that will give them the information or the insights that they need to sort of do their job. So that's sort of what I would say. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, Daniel, for taking the time to talk to me today. What you've had to say, I think, is going to be valuable. The work you're doing is very valuable. Thank you also for doing that. It's based in the US, but its implications are for much wider than that. And so thank you for doing that and taking the time today.
Yeah, happy to. Thank you for the interesting questions. Like a discussion.